December 19, 1944, the frozen forests of the Ardennes echoed with a thunder no one could mistake. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, muffling the sound of the dead. The German 5th Panzer Army had surrounded Bastogne, a small Belgian town that stood like a bleeding heart in the center of the Battle of the Bulge. Inside, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were running out of everything: ammunition, food, bandages, and even hope. The temperature plunged to 20 below zero. The wounded froze where they lay, and the cries of men buried under snowdrifts became whispers, swallowed by the cold. Outside the perimeter, German tanks rumbled through the haze, confident that the encircled Americans would soon break. But something inside Bastogne refused to die. The men called it the Bastogne spirit, a mix of stubbornness, madness, and the raw will to survive. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the German 11th Panzer Corps, sent a neatly typed letter under a white flag to the American lines. It was a demand for surrender. The message was cold, professional, almost courteous. It warned of total destruction should the 101st refuse. The letter was delivered through the snow by German officers and received by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division. McAuliffe read it once, frowned, and looked up. Then came his immortal one-word reply, typed in all caps, "Nuts." When the German envoy asked for a translation, Colonel Harry Kinnard smiled and said, "It means go to hell." That single word rippled through the frozen town like fire. Soldiers who hadn't eaten in 2 days grinned through cracked lips. Nurses wept. Bastogne would not fall, but the reality was grim. Every road was blocked. Every drop of fuel and round of ammunition was counted. C-47 transport planes tried to fly supplies in, but low clouds and German flak turned the sky into a graveyard. The paratroopers tore pages from Bibles to roll cigarettes, melted snow for water, and patched wounds with torn uniforms. Still, they held the perimeter against wave after wave of assaults. German officers began to wonder, what kind of men fight like this, surrounded, starved, and half-frozen? They didn't know it yet, but the answer was about to descend from the clouds in the hundreds. Metal angels in formation, engines roaring against the winter storm. December 23, 1944. The clouds finally broke. For the first time in days, the gray ceiling of the sky split apart, revealing a pale winter sun over the shattered woods of Bastogne. It was then that the German besiegers looked up, and what they saw silenced the battlefield. Out of the horizon came a sound that no soldier on either side could mistake: the deep droning hum of hundreds of aircraft engines. It grew louder with every second until the very air seemed to tremble. The first wave appeared like dark silhouettes against the light. C-47 Skytrains, the lifeline of the surrounded division, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts slicing through the frozen clouds. 241 American planes in total, flying in perfect formation over the besieged town. Inside Bastogne, weary paratroopers stumbled from foxholes and trenches, lifting their faces to the sky. Men who hadn't smiled in days were suddenly laughing, crying, shouting, waving helmets and rifles. Below them, the ground shook as artillery shells continued to land, but no one cared. Crates floated down beneath great white parachutes, scattering across the snow like blessings. Ammunition, medical kits, rations, fuel, blankets, all the things that had become dreams only hours before, were now falling from heaven. The men tore open supply boxes with numb fingers, stuffing chocolate bars and bandages into their pockets. Lighting cigarettes dropped from the sky. For many, it was the first time they believed they might live through Bastogne. Across the lines, German officers watched through binoculars, stunned into silence. What they were witnessing was not simply a supply drop, it was defiance made visible. Every parachute was a declaration that the 101st Airborne would never surrender. Machine gunners in the forest opened fire, desperate to cut the parachutes from the air, but the sky was too wide, the drop too massive. German anti-aircraft batteries roared to life, but their shells burst harmlessly below the passing formations. The sound of the engines drowned out the cries of war, echoing through the valleys like an iron hymn. When the planes turned back west, the snow was littered with open crates and broken parachute cords. But something had changed. Bastogne was alive again. The 101st, once starving and broken, had been resurrected in spirit. From that moment forward, the Germans knew the truth. Bastogne would not fall, not to hunger, not to winter, and not to fear. Night fell on Bastogne like a frozen curtain. The forest glowed faintly under the moon, shadows of bare trees cast long across the snow. From the German side it looked like a tomb, dark, quiet, and still. But beneath that silence the town pulsed with new life. The air was filled with the distant hum of generators powered by the freshly dropped fuel. Medics in shattered churches tore open new crates of bandages and morphine, whispering prayers over the wounded who had clung to life just hours too long. Paratroopers passed around cans of rations, sharing spoonfuls of beans and coffee as if it were a banquet. It wasn't just food, it was proof they hadn't been abandoned. The 101st Airborne was still in the fight. In the German lines, disbelief turned to unease. Intelligence officers studied the scale of the resupply and realized something terrifying. The Luftwaffe had failed. The once feared German air superiority was gone. Not a single American plane had been intercepted that day. A Wehrmacht colonel near Neff recorded in his diary that, "The enemy has the skies now, and with it, our doom." The men who had once mocked the trapped Americans began to whisper that perhaps the trap had turned on them. The snow carried rumors. Whispers of Patton's army moving north, of tanks rumbling through the frozen Ardennes to break the siege. Every German soldier could feel it, even if he dared not speak. Time was slipping away. Inside Bastogne, there was no sense of victory, only grim determination. The men still shivered in foxholes dug into frozen mud, wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. They rotated sentries in pairs so no one would fall asleep and freeze. Artillery thundered from every direction, shaking the ground with each impact. Yet the paratroopers held fast. They fought not for glory or medals, but for one another. For the man in the next hole, for the wounded in the cellar, for the belief that holding Bastogne meant something far larger than themselves. The supply drops had bought them more than ammunition. They had bought them time. Enough time for something vast and unstoppable to move their way through the snow. A force that would change everything. The German commanders didn't know when or where it would hit, only that it was coming. And with each passing hour, the sound of distant engines on the horizon grew louder. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne had become a frozen fortress. The town was surrounded by a ring of shattered tanks, burnt-out trucks, and bodies half buried in snow. Every street corner had turned into a defensive post, every building a bunker. The church in the town center, once filled with worshippers, was now a makeshift hospital, where nurses worked by candlelight, their hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Outside, the howling wind carried the low moan of artillery fire, never-ending like the breath of death itself. In those bitter hours, the men of the 101st found ways to hold their sanity together. Some carved messages into their rifles. Others sang faint Christmas songs, voices cracking through the night air. Chaplains moved from foxhole to foxhole, offering blessings to men who didn't expect to see the morning. The smell of cordite and frozen blood hung over everything. Yet amidst that desolation, something impossible happened. A few hours of stillness. The guns stopped. The wind softened. And in that silence, for the first time since the siege began, a faint bell rang from the church steeple. A single note of Christmas in a place that had forgotten peace. But peace was only a ghost that night. German soldiers watched the glow of candles flicker in Bastogne from their lines, their own fires hidden under canvas and dirt. They were cold too, and hungry and tired of killing. Some had been promised victory before the new year, a final blow that would split the Allied lines. Instead, they stared across the snow at a town that refused to die. In the command tents, German officers argued over maps and orders. Every hour brought new reports. Patton's Third Army was advancing through the storm, covering impossible ground. The Americans at Bastogne weren't collapsing. They were holding, waiting. Then at midnight, the first flares lit the sky again. The siege resumed with a fury not seen before. German artillery zeroed in on the town's heart, smashing homes and hospitals alike. The 101st returned fire with every shell they had left. The Christmas bell stopped ringing, replaced by the scream of falling steel. But even as the sky turned red, one truth had already taken root deep inside both armies. Bastogne wasn't a position anymore. It was a symbol, and symbols don't surrender. Christmas morning arrived under fire. Snow drifted through shattered windows as American medics dragged the wounded from burning ruins. The church-turned-hospital trembled with every distant explosion. Inside, a nurse named Renée Lemaire worked without pause, her uniform stained with blood. She was Belgian, volunteering alongside the 101st, tending to men who were no longer strangers but brothers. When a German bomb hit the building next door, she didn't run. Moments later, another shell struck closer. The blast blew out the walls and set the church ablaze. Renée died trying to save her patients. The survivors later said her last words were a whisper for mercy. To this day, she's remembered as the Angel of Bastogne. Outside, the snow turned black with smoke. American soldiers dug deeper into the frozen ground, clutching rifles so cold they burned their hands. Supplies from the air had kept them alive, but not warm. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Some men had to be carried from the lines, their feet wrapped in rags. Yet no one broke. Colonel Robert Sink walked the perimeter in silence, watching his men stand against an army 5 times their size. "No one gets out," one soldier muttered, staring into the fog. "So we hold." Across the encirclement, German commanders were growing desperate. The Luftwaffe couldn't break the American supply line. Every attempt to storm the town cost lives and machines they couldn't replace. Recon reports confirmed the worst. Patton's armor was advancing from the south faster than anyone thought possible. If Bastogne didn't fall soon, the entire German offensive could unravel. Orders came down to crush the pocket once and for all. Hundreds of artillery pieces opened up in unison, pounding the town with a storm of fire. Buildings collapsed, snow melted into ash, and yet, through the chaos, the paratroopers fired back. In the middle of it all, the air raid sirens began to wail, not from the Germans, but from above. More C-47s appeared through the blizzard, engines howling over the smoke, dropping another wave of parachutes through the inferno. The men looked up from their foxholes, half blind from exhaustion and disbelief. Even hell couldn't stop the sky from opening again. The message was clear: Bastogne still lived and the world hadn't forgotten them. By December 26th, the siege reached its breaking point. The German lines were tightening, their artillery pounding the town without pause. Smoke hung low, clinging to the snow like a curse. Entire blocks of Bastogne were reduced to rubble. The trees on the outskirts stood stripped and splintered. The 101st Airborne, battered but unbroken, clung to every inch of ground. Many had not slept in days. They fought in shifts measured by survival, 2 hours on, 1 hour off if the shells allowed. Medics stitched wounds in freezing mud using morphine sparingly, saving the last doses for those who could still fight. In command, posts dug deep into the earth. Maps were lit by flickering lanterns. The radio crackled with fragments of news. Patton's Third Army was close, only miles away. The roads were clogged with wreckage and mines, but his columns kept pushing. Every man in Bastogne knew the sound they were waiting for, the deep rolling thunder of American armor. Until then, they fought like wolves cornered by the hunt. One German assault after another broke against their defenses. Machine guns jammed from the cold, mortars froze, and still the men fired, shouting through smoke and snow. On the German side, frustration turned to dread. The officers had expected surrender days ago. Their fuel was running low, their men exhausted. Reconnaissance reported American armor movement south of the town, but the reports were dismissed as impossible. "No tanks could move through that terrain," said one officer. He was wrong. The next morning would prove it. That night, Bastogne lay under a deathly calm. Snowflakes fell like ash over a town that looked more like a graveyard than a stronghold. Soldiers whispered quietly to one another in their holes, remembering home, remembering warmth. In a cellar beneath the ruins of a bakery, a group of paratroopers shared their last can of coffee. One of them, his hands shaking from cold, muttered, "If we make it through this, they'll never forget Bastogne." Above them, the sky was silent, waiting. The men didn't know that only a few miles away, Patton's Sherman tanks were already rolling through the night. Engines growling, headlights blacked out, snow kicking up behind them. The steel beasts of the Third Army were coming, and with them, the sound of deliverance. Dawn broke gray and bitter on December 27, 1944. The snow was still falling, fine as dust, as though 101st Airborne held its breath. The German bombardment had slowed during the night, replaced by an eerie quiet that no one trusted. The men peered from their trenches through the haze, rifles ready, nerves raw. Somewhere beyond the smoke and trees, something was moving, something big. The first to hear it were the sentries on the southern edge of the town, a low, distant rumble, steady and growing. At first they thought it was another wave of German armor. Then came the faintest sound of a bugle, and a voice on the radio broke through the static. "This is the Third Army. We're here." Moments later, out of the white mist, the first Sherman tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division appeared. Their olive-drab hulls were scarred from battle, tracks grinding through snow and ice, engines roaring like thunder across the frozen countryside. Behind them marched weary infantrymen with frostbitten faces and grim smiles. They had fought their way through impossible roads to reach Bastogne. As the first tank rolled past the American lines, paratroopers stood up from their foxholes, too stunned to speak. Then came cheers, raw, hoarse, uncontrollable. Some men laughed, others cried openly, pounding their helmets, shaking hands, embracing whoever stood beside them. Bastogne had been saved. Inside the German ranks, the realization struck like a hammer. Their encirclement was broken. Patton's armor had ripped open the southern corridor, and now the Americans were flooding in with supplies, medics, and reinforcements. The German command tried to reorganize, but it was too late. The window for victory had closed. The Ardennes offensive, once Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allies, was now bleeding out in the snow. As Patton's men linked up with the paratroopers, reporters and war photographers followed in their wake. They captured the haunting aftermath. Men standing among ruins, faces blackened with soot, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a quiet, unshakable pride. Bastogne had endured. For 7 days, the 101st Airborne had fought against cold, hunger, and overwhelming odds. They hadn't just held the town, they'd held the line for an entire continent. And now, as the smoke cleared, the world would finally see what unbreakable looked like. When Patton's armor finally rolled through the streets of Bastogne, the scene defied belief. What had once been a quiet Belgian town now looked like the ruins of another world. Burned-out tanks lined the roads like iron skeletons. Houses were reduced to splinters, and the smell of smoke and blood clung to the wind. American medics moved through the wreckage, stepping carefully over frozen bodies, friend and foe alike. Some paratroopers, too numb to celebrate, simply sat down in the snow and stared at nothing, their rifles still clutched in trembling hands. The cost of survival had been carved deep into their faces. Reporters who entered the town described it as a vision of hell held by ghosts. Yet within that devastation, the men of the 101st Airborne stood tall, their tattered division patches still visible through the grime. They had done the impossible, held Bastogne under siege by 7 German divisions. When asked later how they managed it, one paratrooper simply muttered, "We had no choice." Another said, "We were too cold to quit." For the rest of their lives, those who were there would speak of it not as a victory, but as endurance born from something beyond courage, an instinct to resist when reason said not to. German prisoners captured after the siege spoke in disbelief. Many had expected to find corpses when they entered the town. Instead, they found men still fighting, still shouting, still alive. One German sergeant later confessed that when the 241 planes came over Bastogne, "We knew it was over. No army so determined could ever be destroyed." Even some German officers admitted privately that Bastogne marked the turning point, the moment when the Wehrmacht realized the war in the West was lost. As Patton's tanks refueled and resupplied the paratroopers, the two groups of soldiers exchanged weary salutes. The armor crews called them legends. The airborne called them saviors. Snow began to fall again, light and silent, covering the dead and the wreckage alike. For the men who survived, it was the first quiet snowfall they had seen that didn't bring fear. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but the memory of it would never thaw. In that frozen pocket of defiance, the 101st Airborne had carved their place into eternity. You said, in the days following the relief of Bastogne, the battlefield told its own silent story. Hundreds of German vehicles lay abandoned in the woods, half-tracks frozen solid, their engines cracked open by the cold. Horses, still harnessed to wagons, stood stiff in the snow. On the American side, soldiers moved slowly through the wreckage, collecting their dead. The frozen bodies were laid out in neat rows beside shattered walls, tags tied to boots stiff with ice. Snow covered everything in a white shroud, softening the horror but never erasing it. Those who survived walked among the fallen with a quiet reverence. They knew each body represented another man who refused to yield. Military historians would later call the defense of Bastogne a miracle of logistics and will. But for the men who were there, it had nothing to do with miracles. It was blood, cold, and discipline. Every paratrooper had fought until his weapon jammed, then used his hands, knives, or even stones to survive. Many had frostbite so severe, that they never walked normally again, yet none of them ever spoke of surrender. In their minds, Bastogne was never about territory. It was about defiance. They had been told to hold the town, and so they did, no matter what the world threw at them. On the German side, reports flowed back to headquarters with grim precision. "Enemy forces at Bastogne are resilient beyond expectation," one message read. "Air resupply and morale appear unbreakable." It was the first acknowledgement from the Wehrmacht that the American spirit of resistance had outlasted their offensive might. Even Hitler himself received word of the debacle, and his rage was volcanic. Bastogne was supposed to have been a stepping stone to the Meuse River. Now it had become a graveyard for his last hopes in the West. As winter deepened, the 101st Airborne remained in Bastogne, repairing their lines, digging new graves, and reinforcing the wrecked town. There was no celebration, just exhaustion and a grim understanding that the war was far from over. But deep down, each man knew something irrevocable had shifted. The German army had thrown its best against them and failed. Bastogne was not just a victory, it was a message carved in snow and blood. America would bend but never break. The weeks that followed turned Bastogne into both a scar and a shrine. The wounded were evacuated one by one, loaded into trucks bound for the rear. Those who could still walk stayed behind, rebuilding defenses for the next phase of the Ardennes campaign. Snow melted into red mud as spring crept closer, revealing the full scale of what had happened. Trees were shredded to splinters, tanks lay overturned in the ditches, and the town itself, once picturesque and quiet, was little more than a skeleton of stone and smoke. Yet in that ruin there was life. The people of Bastogne emerged from cellars and ruins, faces pale, eyes wide, offering bread and wine to the soldiers who had saved them. Some wept openly, embracing men they had never met, whispering mercy through tears. In the aftermath, Allied engineers arrived to clear mines and mark graves. Rows of wooden crosses spread across the snow-covered fields. Chaplains read prayers over frozen earth while engines idled in the distance. Many of the paratroopers stood in silence, staring at the crosses of friends who had fought beside them just days before. There was no cheering, no music, no parade. Just the sound of wind passing through the broken windows of Bastogne. The victory was real, but it had come at a price too heavy for celebration. For the Germans, the retreat from Bastogne marked the end of belief. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Thousands of German soldiers were now prisoners, their weapons frozen or abandoned, their dreams of victory extinguished. Reports from officers painted a picture of despair. Soldiers marching east in silence, their uniforms tattered, their morale broken. One officer wrote simply, "The forest devoured us." Back in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne became legends. Journalists photographed their gaunt faces, their torn uniforms, their eyes hollow yet unyielding. They were the men who had refused to surrender when surrounded by death itself. Time magazine called them the heroes of Bastogne, but the soldiers themselves rejected the title. When asked how they held, one replied quietly, "We were just doing our job." And in that simple answer lay the truth of Bastogne, heroism born not of glory, but of endurance. As the winter of 1945 dragged on, Bastogne remained a symbol that reached far beyond the battlefield. Across the Allied lines, soldiers spoke of it with awe, how an entire division had stood against annihilation and refused to yield. In London and Washington, newspapers printed the story in bold letters. Bastogne holds. To a world weary of war, it was more than a military report. It was a story of defiance, of faith in the face of despair. Mothers read it to their children. Soldiers in distant foxholes drew strength from it. Even those far from the front understood what it meant, that no matter how dark the hour, resistance was still possible. Inside Bastogne, however, the reality was quieter, harder. The 101st Airborne continued to fight through exhaustion, frostbite, and trauma. Many had buried more friends than they could count. Medics who had once treated the wounded now walked the cemeteries in silence, reading names they knew by heart. A few wrote in diaries describing how the nights were still haunted by the echoes of shellfire. One paratrooper wrote simply, "It's quiet now, but it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the world forgot how to breathe." The German prisoners captured around Bastogne were marched through the ruins, many staring at the paratroopers in disbelief. They had been told the Americans were weak, broken and without discipline. What they saw instead were soldiers who looked like specters, emaciated, frostbitten, covered in grime, yet still standing, still armed, still watching. One captured officer muttered under his breath, "No wonder we lost." Even among the Wehrmacht, Bastogne became a whispered legend, a reminder that technology and numbers could be crushed by will alone. By February, Patton's forces had pushed the German army back toward the Rhine. The Ardennes offensive was over, and with it, the last German hope for turning the tide of war. But in the heart of every man who had fought at Bastogne, the siege never truly ended. The memory of frozen nights, of falling shells, of parachutes descending like ghosts, those things stayed. Years later, when the survivors gathered again, they didn't speak much about tactics or medals. They spoke about the sound, the deep hum of engines that had once split the clouds and saved them. The sound of 241 planes that told them, in the darkest moment of the war, that they were not alone. Long after the war ended, Bastogne became quiet again. The snow returned each winter, falling over the fields where men had once fought and died, covering the scars of battle beneath a white calm. The forests grew back slowly, their trunks twisting around the remnants of bunkers and rusting helmets half buried in soil. The people rebuilt their town from ashes, stone by stone, never forgetting the winter when the world came apart and refused to yield. For decades, veterans of the 101st Airborne returned to that place. Older now, walking slowly through the same streets they had once defended as boys. They would stop by the church, rebuilt from rubble, and stand in silence where the angel of Bastogne, René Lemaire, had fallen. Some brought their children. Some came alone. All of them carried the same memory in their eyes. They spoke little of what they'd done. When asked, many shrugged it off as luck or duty. But historians who studied their ordeal knew it was more than that. Bastogne had revealed something elemental about human endurance. In a war defined by machines, tanks, rockets, bombers, the siege was fought and won by flesh and willpower. The men had no warmth, no food, no promise of rescue. What they had was the conviction that surrender was worse than death. That conviction, born in the frozen trenches of the Ardennes, reshaped the very meaning of courage. Across the Atlantic, America built monuments to honor the defenders of Bastogne. Bronze eagles, marble walls, quiet fields of white crosses stretching to the horizon. Tourists visit, snap photographs, then move on. But for those who survived, the memories never fade. Some say they still dream of the sky that day, the endless roar of C-47s, the parachutes blossoming like flowers against the winter clouds. For them, Bastogne was never just a battle. It was proof that even in the bleakest corner of history, hope can fall from the heavens. And for the German soldiers who once encircled the town, many later admitted the truth. They hadn't been defeated by superior numbers or firepower. They were undone by something invisible, an enemy spirit that refused to die. The day they saw those 241 planes overhead, they understood it fully. Bastogne would never surrender. Not then, not ever. 80 years later, the name Bastogne still carries the weight of that winter. Veterans are gone now. Their voices preserved only in crackling recordings, their faces faded in black and white photographs. Yet their silence speaks louder than words. Historians still debate strategy, logistics, and numbers, but none of that explains the soul of Bastogne. The story survives because it was never just about war. It was about endurance against the impossible, about men who stood in a blizzard of fire and refused to vanish. Modern travelers walking through Bastogne today see plaques, museums, and the massive Martison Memorial, its stone walls carved with the names of all 50 U.S. states. But if you wander beyond the town center, into the woods where the foxholes still remain, you can still feel it, the cold, the quiet, the echo of a heartbeat beneath the earth. The trenches are filled with leaves now, but they tell a story older than the trees that grew around them. A story of men who fought not for conquest but for each other. One of those men, Private Vincent Speranza, returned to Bastogne decades later. During the siege, he had carried beer to the wounded in his helmet, lifting spirits when hope was gone. In old age, he stood again in the same square, surrounded by the townspeople who remembered. They raised glasses and sang. The song that echoed through the square that day wasn't one of victory. It was one of gratitude, a quiet hymn for those who never came home. Tears fell freely, not from grief but from remembrance. Bastogne had survived, and so had its story. The Siege of Bastogne became more than a chapter in military history. It became a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. It showed the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield to it. In the snow and silence of that Belgian winter, surrounded and starving, the 101st Airborne stood their ground against an empire's fury. And when the Germans looked up to see 241 American planes tearing through the clouds, they understood a truth that history would never let them forget. The town of Bastogne was never meant to fall, because the men inside it had already become unbreakable.